to get started right away. We're a bit pressed for time today. A couple of housekeeping notes. I think everyone who's going on to Saskatoon brought their luggage and has placed it in the back part of the IKG, the gallery, hopefully. Mick will get your luggage. Where are you? Okay, so we're missing one piece of luggage, but coffee and tea, as everyone knows, I think, is in the far gallery down the hall. Please help yourself, come and go as you wish. We're also going to, again, speaking of pressed for time, we're going to finish right at 12. We have an open house here at ACAD that somehow impacts on us and takes precedence over the content driving part of our college here. So it's a bit of a gripe of mine that I'll share with you. But we do have to be out of here at 12, and we're going to try to respect that. So if we stop quite abruptly with the second panel at 12 o'clock, please carry on with the conversations elsewhere. And the people who are going to Saskatoon certainly will carry on with the conversation. So without further ado, Ashok is going to give us a very brief recap of yesterday's activities, and then we'll begin with the first panel. Use this? Or this one?
Yes? Okay.
I can move over. Nope.
Me? Is this good? Okay. Just a very brief recap then. I'll go through a few of what the things that happened yesterday for those who weren't here, and then we'll shift right into the current panel. Yesterday we opened, of course, with Siksika Elder Margaret Waterchief, and she said something very interesting about the travesty of Treaty 7 of 1877, but she also mentioned something very interesting, which is the potential of rebirthing from the hearts of the people, and I think that was an inspiring note to begin with. Jen picked up from there, and she talked about how this entire gathering had started off as a concert of 6 or 7 voices and had built considerably from there to what we see today, 12 years later. She talked about monumental notions of naming. She used some of her own familial histories to talk about monuments as colonial strategies and racialized epithets that became place names. Notions of defacement and resistance to monumentalizing too, which is something that I think has come up yesterday and will be a recurring theme today and the next couple of days too. And basically she said we need to teach art differently, a matter of survival, and that again is a key point. After that, of course, we had Jimmy Durham coming in on Skype. He talked about a number of different things. It's so hard to synopsize what someone like Durham would say. So some of the moments that I got from him were, he was talking about monuments as flags of conquest, and the history of the people of the Americas is not the history of the colonizers. He also mentioned, and this has been something he's talked about for a while, how every monument in the Americas is a violence towards indigenous people. He sees dams, highways, and of course even cities as monuments. Monumentality as stupidity is what I put down for him. In the first panel, which I had the pleasure of moderating, Maria, of course, Maria Teresa Alves showed a very powerful video on the violence against indigenous peoples, and she said comparing artists to heroes could be a bit of a problem because of how that's worked. The language is tainted with violence. Kathy Mattis followed her, talking about Louis Riel monuments, and did a very strong gender analysis of that, where were the roles of Métis women in this, and I thought it was a very powerful way to insinuate a very strong presence, history of imagined communities. Paul Chatt-Smith, it was very rhetorical in some of what he was talking about in a very short presentation. What survives? Do we want these things to survive? And then moved to the motif of genocide. And we talked a bit last night at the reception afterwards about that. Something I think, again, needs to recur, not just a gathering like this, but what do we then do with the voices, the words, and the powerful people we have here? How do we do things that may sound ambitious, but how do we stop genocides? How do we make things happen the way we need to make them happen? Jeff Thomas talked about remembering where you come from, not letting yourself go silent, refusal and resistance, counter movements, a search and journey that still goes on, and the stories about activism that were important. Jeffrey Gibson, whose work is next door, of course, talked about how to identify without being isolated, speaking of traumas and how we surpass those challenges, and imagining a better place to work from. And then the last, yesterday's second and last panel, Laurel Reuter talked about a criticism of traditional forms of monuments and seeking something that is experiential in art, which I thought was an interesting notion. What experiences do we bring into this? And very powerfully, the return of the forgotten, of the, she was talking about the disappeared. How does that become part of our present? Sandra Semchuk, a beautiful piece talking about her work in collaboration with her late partner, James Nicholas. Humor, kind of inversion of generosity she kept playing with, and it was, I would say, in very typical Sandra Semchuk way, it was a playful movement towards a very strong political motivation. Then Richard Hill, monument as a sign of the impossibility of remembering, process of mourning as a failure of mourning, the role of object attached to mourning, and he said something interesting about objects as time travelers, which is a key point I think we'll return to. And he ended on a very interesting moment about monuments that maybe shouldn't be monuments. He talked about the hideous monuments that are out there that are perhaps there to impose closure when we should be opening things up. Geert Torholm talked about, in a very interesting way, outside of he went through a Sami narrative of presence, and it really wasn't about monuments, and he said afterwards, I'm not so sure I want to talk about monuments, and this is a different way of looking at it. And then finally we had Marcia Crosby. She showed some excerpts from her PhD, Paper Covers Rock, and it was a really interesting tracking of associations with text, image, and voice, multiple voices of technology that interrupted the linear flow of what we might call monument building. This was my reading. So that was a very brief synopsis of where things were at yesterday, I think. I probably got a lot of it wrong, but I'm hoping the rest of the day we'll get a lot of it right. So I'm going to pass it then over to the moderator. Where's moderator? There's Ronald. And we'll start the day, and good luck to everybody. There you go.
Thank you. Just give us a second here, sorry. First of all, welcome everybody, and while we're doing this, I'd like to acknowledge that we stand on Blackfoot traditional lands today, and I'd like to thank them for their tolerance and patience, and to assure them that our desire to learn is sincere. My name is Ron Hawker. I am an art historian here at the Alberta College of Art and Design. Prior to coming here, I lived in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates for 15 years. I have a kind of schizophrenic practice. Part of what I do is look at Aboriginal art in Canada, and part of what I do is look at tribal arts in the UAE. And last night, after hearing what everybody had to say about monuments, I had a personal response to it. So as I'm introducing our panelists today, this is going to run behind me. And the idea here is just to show you some images around the cult of personality, which is a very important part of the political culture there, and then switch to the Arab Spring and the kinds of defacements that are occurring there. And the idea here is just to visually provoke some thoughts about monuments. How do we define monuments, and what does it mean to deface monuments? No, not that one. This one. Just open it around it, please. Thank you. So first of all, I'd like to introduce our panelists, and the name of our panel is Defacement: What Happens When Monuments Are Altered. And I'm just trying to see who's sitting where. So let's start from the farthest on my left. We have Jeff Thomas, and then who's next? I can't see. Manuel, Piña, Baldoquin, Richard Thomas, and Candice Hopkins. Richard Hill, sorry.
I'd rather be Richard.
It's early, right? Okay. You guys have had your chance to have your coffee. And then, of course, Candice Hopkins, and then Michael Taussig. And I think we'll start with, from the right, Michael Taussig.
So you're not going to do your sequence?
It's behind us, but it seems to have stopped now.
Huh?
It was behind us, but it seems to have stopped.
Well, you can't get it up?
No, we've got it up. It's just... All right.
Well, look, I'm looking at you,
Yeah.
looking at me.
I didn't want to take your 10 minutes.
Thoroughly iconoclastic gesture. Good morning, and Ron, are you going to show us more? Or
We've got 2 minutes. I mean 2 seconds, sorry.
Yeah, okay.
So, you want to have a conversation? Or
No, you tell us what...
I just want to show you these images. That's about it. You know, the different kinds of defacement. I thought we should do Michael, one more. Yeah, now we're done. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for coming. Thank the organizers so much. They're learning in an enormous way the things that I would never have believed, and the feeling here is so good. I wanted to, in the spirit of Jimmy Durham, I found some defaced glasses on the pavement as I was walking to the conference today. This is a sort of debris and riffraff of destruction that one finds on one's walks. Once were nice sunglasses, and now something else, for which Jimmy said he feels intense sadness and welcomes as friends. Now that's a complicated way to view defacement or iconoclasm. What are the chain of emotions, the various patterns of turmoil that are put into place when something is destroyed, especially if it's surrounded by taboos, not to mention laws. And that's going to be a good part of what I want to talk about today. I was struck by the findings of the Supreme Court of the United States not so long ago concerning burning of the flag, the US flag. Quote, both Congress and the states have enacted numerous laws regulating misuse of the American flag. Until 1967, Congress left regulation of misuse of the flag up to the states. Now, however, Title 18 U.S.C. number 700A, the law, right, provides, quote, whoever knowingly casts contempt upon any flag of the United States by publicly mutilating, defacing, defiling, burning, or trampling upon it shall be fined not more than $1,000 or imprisoned for not more than 1 year or both. Quote, continuing, moreover, Johnson, who the case was about, he burned a flag in Texas, moreover, Johnson was prosecuted because he knew that his politically charged expression would cause serious offense, which is what we saw with Riel yesterday, right? If he had burned the flag as a means of disposing of it because it was dirty or torn, he would not have been converted of flag desecration. So note the word desecration. I use the word defacement. I use the word iconoclasm. Now here's a third term to think about, desecration, which is an interesting term, right? Because desecration means anti, non, inverted, sacred. So immediately in the law, there's this direct reference to the sacred quality, which emerges, however, most pointedly when the defacement occurs. It was there all the time, but it needed the burning to bring it out, like a funeral pyre. This is a major point, I think, about iconoclasm and defacement. It needs the destructive act in order to arouse, to stimulate, to wake the sacred. But it's, of course, negative sacred, if we can call it that. It's a negative sacred, it's desecration, okay? Because he knew that his politically charged expression would cause serious offense. If he had burned the flag as a means of disposing of it because it was dirty or torn, he would not have been convicted of flag desecration under Texas law, and so on. I wanted to think of Jimmy as a sort of desecrator, defacer, iconoclast, but I put him in the bracket of what Maria Teresa used the term, I think, sort of about cowboys and so on. She, like, there's direct confrontation and there's indirect or passive. Well, I'm going to use the term with Jimmy of a gentle iconoclast, all right? A delicate, gentle, witty iconoclast. And I see him, I know this is a cliche, and don't come down too hard on me. Sometimes cliches exist because they're good. And my cliche is to think of a trickster and the trickster tradition in, I guess, most cultures in the world. And a trickster is impossible to you follow, but you can never pin them down. You get what I mean. And I've been working the last year or two on a concept I call mastery of non-mastery as a way of dealing with domination. Domination of nature, domination of people, domination of the intellect. And how do you not dominate, or how do you deal with domination? And it seems to me it's in this tricksterish fashion that you don't want to be a dominator. You don't want to replace the state with another state. You don't want to replace, I think, a monument with another monument. So there's the aesthetic and the politics. It's an anarchistic sort of approach. It's ethic, it's political, it's philosophical, mastery of non-mastery. So that's my sort of framework for a lot of this. Now, I wanted to show, first of all, you've got that slide up? Yeah. I was thinking, that's just what I showed Jimmy, and he said, oh, very beautiful. This is the call it an anti-monument, I guess, by Danny Caravan for Walter Benjamin. And what I could go on for a long time about this, but I haven't got the time. The Corfu looks like this to me. This is my memory. This is a cleavage in the Pyrenees on the Mediterranean. There's Corfu. The black holes are these incredible tunnels that come out of the mountain with these weird railway tracks that are so spooky. Up on the right is the Catholic cemetery with the steps and the little chapel. And down below it, basically the same thing, built underground is this tunnel, which is the memorial to Walter Benjamin. If you walk down it and you look out on the sea, and there's a quotation from his work. And I wanted to talk about how that actually fits in, so concealed, inconspicuous. He was supposed to have been buried in that Catholic burial. And the stories about him and his absence radiate out into this landscape as I described yesterday. Okay, could I have the next one? Yeah. Okay. I wanted to move to the next. No, keep going. Okay. I wanted to move to this mastery of mastery. This is occupation of Zuccotti Park. Just put that in your coat. Oh, sorry. You're going to walk behind me. This is Zuccotti Park, which kicked off this fantastically energizing Occupy Wall Street movement. And there's this huge, a big joie de vivre statue. The boyfriend of the woman who runs, monuments for New York City, he of course got the commission, joie de vivre. And all the turmoil and all the great things that are happening, the tiny little sticker, it's about maybe max 3 inches. And I looked down, and this is what it said, stuck on joie de vivre. It's that sort of wit, that sort of defacement that I like very much. Could we move on to the next one? This will do. Ditto. Here the monuments are laid out horizontally, no verticality. Verticality is so phallic, it's not funny. So the next thing is the ad hoc, impromptu quality. Everybody was on their knees, practicing the mastery of non-mastery, making designs, making smart comments, making smart-ass comments. This is the one I like the best of all. Against Wall Street, right? Keep moving. Now, this is a bit more complicated because I'm a fuzzy-minded guy anyway. I was very taken with the way people held their signs, like this. And the way they looked at you, they're like zombies. And they would, it seemed like for hours. And photographers would come, and they were totally unfazed. They were like mannequins. And I kept thinking, well, they're sort of like monuments. They've become monuments. What they say is as if they've been waiting to say for the last 5 years, and here's they've got the opportunity. And their zombie-like, this stillness of history that's in them is also extremely ephemeral. They'll pack up in 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and it's limited for a few months. It's got a death sentence written over it, the occupation and so forth. So it's this combination of stasis and movement that I wanted to sort of bring out. These people are like human monuments. And now I wanted to talk just a little bit about Robert Musil, Austrian, who talked about, we never notice statues, he says. We never notice monuments until they're screwed up, till they're damaged in some sort, or there's a protest or a ritual about them, and then suddenly they come alive, like the burning of the flag. There has been a lot of talk about transgression merely suspends the norm, does not destroy it. And some people, that's Marcel Mauss. And people go even further and say, well, not only does transgression merely suspend the norm, but it sort of strengthens it. So if you damage a statue, or if you damage something, you damage the flag, you arouse all this passion, and in a way, you've made, possibly, this is the argument, made the flag stronger. So it's very delicate terrain that we're walking on. I mean, you know, the sort of mad passion to destroy can also strengthen that which you are fighting against. Hence, mastery of non-mastery. Hence, that sort of more sophisticated double take, which you see with the trickster. Foucault, who wrote the introduction to Bataille's collected works, he talks about, however, if transgression or defacement suspends the norm, pushes back on the norm, pushes back on the status quo, pushes back on the monument, only temporarily, nevertheless, there's a space created, maybe for a second, maybe for an hour, maybe much longer. And this space does not conform to everyday laws. That's the way I see it. And Foucault reaches for this very hyperbolic language to try and describe what it's like to live in the zone of transgression. What's up goes down, you know. What's black is white. Everything is buzzing and humming in this, what I call the zone. What does that zone consist of? What are we to do with it? Do we recognize it as I've described it, and so forth? Another property of defacement that occurs to me, that in my studies, is once something is defaced, it leads to more defacement, like a contagion and a proliferation. For example, when people protest against the burning of the flag, or they protest against statues of the King and Queen of England naked and so forth, the letters come to the newspaper. People come to these defaced monuments and statues and create alternative statues. They come with placards. Then the opposition comes with its. And they use language which they would not normally consider decent or appropriate. It's like once you've pressed the defacement button, this stream of defacings goes on in language and ritual. So contagion, proliferation is a fascinating sequence. I think we saw that with the Riel history. Now, could we switch to the... how am I doing for time? 5 minutes?
5 minutes, why not?
You done?
No.
I'm done already?
Yeah.
5 minutes.
But you have 5 minutes. We'll give you another 5.
All right, let's go down to the bottom. We'll miss this one here. This is a weird drawing I did in the hotel room. I'm sorry, you know, we don't have the PowerPoint, guys. Iconoclastic gesture, in case you didn't get it. A non-drawer who draws. This is a completely, working on a completely different stream. I work a lot in Colombia since 1969, and I spent part of the 90s in Venezuela, and I was totally taken by the way people would be possessed. There's a magic mountain. People would go to the mountain when they're feeling sad, when their economy's bad, when they're sick, and with a healer become possessed by a spirit who's usually traced to the history of the Venezuelan state. And these figures that appear, many of them are Indios, like El Indio Guaycapuro or El Negro Felipe. They're the sort of the common, the textbook is full of the stories of the common people becoming fighters and eventually creating the Venezuelan state. And the Venezuelan state produces the textbooks, and this seeps into popular culture. There's so this is pretty amazing that these icons of the Venezuelan state are literally possessed. They come back through history, 400 years, 200 years, and the healer who's possessed by this can effect cures. about 50 miles from the Magic Mountain, there's this Arch of Triumph, which Jimmy talks about also with his collapsible arches of triumph. And this is the orange, and behind that, underneath it is the tomb for the unknown soldier. In the yellow, the mountain of dead. I mean, this is so gross. You cannot believe this place. Who wants monuments, right? Well, this is the monument to really, really get excited about. There's Bolivar on a horse in blue on top of the mountain of the dead, and all along this huge white concrete runway. It's scary, it's so big. You feel like a little inconspicuous ant there. There are these statues in black to the generals, you know, generally white generals who commanded the war. And then there's one statue might be to El Negro Felipe. And he's the one who will be cast in plaster of Paris, along with Indio Guaycapuro and lots of Indians and black soldiers that you buy in the store, that you take to the mountain and help you become possessed by the icons of the state. It's enormously rich thing to talk about. One thing you might think about is the use of the dead and war, the spirits of the dead and war, to strengthen the state. And what happens here, it seems to me, one of the things that happens is that quote-unquote ordinary people use that magic of the state to improve their everyday life. And rarely do I find the magic of the state through monumentation as powerful and as clear as this. We could talk about it later, and I think I'll finish my talk here, but I wanted to point out that this is not exactly defacement. This is a sort of appropriation of the highfalutin magic of the state from other sorts of magics. And we don't hear much of that in the United States or Canada, I don't think. This is a very, how shall I put it, florid example, which can nevertheless inform your thinking about what it is to become inhabited by the magic of the state. It's not exactly desecration, it's a type of resacralization of the icons in a completely different format. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me, and also to thank Margaret Waterchief for her generosity in sharing her knowledge with us yesterday, and her welcome. So what I want to speak about is, I now live in the Southwest. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and something Jimmy Durham mentioned yesterday, and I've been talking to him about, is the proliferation of monuments to conquistadors that are in that region. And one particular instant. It begins with a severed foot, sliced off of a bronze monument. What was exorcised with this cut? What spirits were released? And what stories? In the first week of January 1998, the day after removing this foot, the anonymous Friends of Acoma Pueblo sent letters to various media outlets in New Mexico. To the Albuquerque Journal, they wrote, "We invite you to visit the Oñate Distortion Museum and Visitor Center, located 8 miles north of Española. We took the liberty of removing Conquistador Don Juan de Oñate's right foot on behalf of our brothers and sisters of Acoma Pueblo. This was done in commemoration of his 400th year anniversary, acknowledging his unasked for exploration of our land. We will be melting his foot down and casting small medallions to be sold to those who are historically ignorant." They also said, "We see no glory in celebrating Oñate's 4th centennial, and we do not want our faces rubbed in it. If you must speak of his expedition, speak of the truth in all its entirety," and all was in italics. And then to the Santa Fe Reporter, they wrote, New Mexico was poised for a grand celebration of the Cuatro Centenario, and we could not let that happen without voicing our existence. Outside of Indian art and gaming, we have become an invisible people, even to ourselves. Many of our people have forgotten how to live. Our actions redirect the thinking of those who have forgotten us. They had some other suggestions of what to do with the foot, aside from melting it down and making medallions to the historically ignorant. They also said that the foot could be cut off 23 more times. They also said it could be used as an image for a new stamp in recognition of the 400-year anniversary. And they also said it could be used to create a statue of the religious leader from Okeowinge, formerly San Juan Pueblo, known as Pope, with the melted metal. But the story begins before this moment, and for this we must go farther back in time, to a more ancient story, in fact, and a myth that has repeated itself over centuries. So Spanish interest in the Southwest was initially sparked by the stories of 4 shipwrecked men off the coast of modern-day Texas. The men were part of the ill-fated Navarez expedition. In the summer of 1536, after an 8-year trek across North America on foot, they arrived in present-day New Mexico, or in Mexico City. And upon their arrival, they recounted stories of, and I quote, fertile and populous lands to the north, places rife with turquoise, with bison hides, and gold and other metals. And these weren't just tall tales. Many of these things they had witnessed firsthand. And for the Spanish, the news was electrifying. It added further evidence to the belief of fantastically wealthy cities in the north, particularly the centuries-old myth of the 7 golden cities, or Cibola. So in 1539, Antonio de Mendoza, the viceroy of New Spain, sent out 4 men on a reconnaissance mission, and the group included Marcos de Niza, a Franciscan friar, experienced in navigation and cosmography, Fray Ornato, who is also Franciscan, as well as an Indian guide who remains unnamed in all of the texts, and Esteban, who was a North African slave of one of the original shipwrecked men. So they traveled over 1,000 miles from the settlement of San Miguel de Culiacan to what were then 7 Zuni communities in present-day New Mexico. So the friar's texts recount a kingdom called Cibola, a place larger than Mexico City, with which local native informants described as wealthy beyond belief. But he never exactly reported cities of gold, and this didn't stop the Spanish from trying to seek them out. He also never entered the walls of the place that people believed to be Cibola. His description was purely based on testimonies from informants and the view from afar, because after reaching the Zuni settlements, Esteban was purportedly killed after he failed to heed orders to turn back, and Marcos would have met a similar fate had he soldiered on. So then, fueled by Spanish imaginings of the wealth in the north, a much larger expedition led by then the governor of Nueva Galicia, Conquistador Coronado, who's well known, followed on the heels of Marcos's journey, and it was a ruinous 4,000-mile trek that spanned from western Mexico to modern-day Kansas. But it wasn't all for a loss, because during his journey, he succeeded in claiming the lands that they traveled through in the name of Spain, including all of present-day New Mexico. The expedition bankrupted most of those involved, and only 100 of the original 1,000 men sent out returned, and the fabled 7 cities of gold were never found. So the Spanish, having conquered many of the great cities of the lower half of the New World, needed to believe in Cibola's existence. The fabled city offered the means to continue to fuel their imperial mission. The very idea that there might be cities of gold is perhaps not so absurd, considering the exceptional material wealth that they had already amassed from pillaging the great cities and cultures of Mesoamerica. So the information regarding Cibola that was brought back by Fray Marcos followed closely on the heels of the discovery of gold in Peru and led many in Mexico to believe that Fray Marcos had discovered yet another source of great wealth. In 1598, on the orders of King Philip II, Don Juan Dionate y Salazar began the process of colonizing the northern portion of Nueva España, which is modern-day New Mexico, and he founded San Gabriel, which is near Oquehuingue Pueblo, or San Juan Pueblo, the first capital, among many other settlements, and became the region's first governor. Don Juan, to give you a little bit of background, and this is going to be brief, he claimed that he was Criollo, someone of pure Spanish blood who was born in the New World. But after doing some digging, a poet, kind of aptly named Viagra, uncovered something else. The Spanish woman recorded as his mother could not have given birth to him, as she was in Spain at the time. So he puts forth, and now many others agree, including scholars, that on his mother's side, Oñate, in fact, was a descendant of Montezuma II. Perhaps unaware of his own heritage, he then married his relative, Doña Isabel de Tolosa Cortez Montezuma, who was the granddaughter of both Cortez and the Emperor Montezuma. So Oñate, born of the conquest of the New World and the violence that flowed from the very first moment European ships docked on the shores of the Americas, would then come to New Mexico. So the violence began almost immediately upon Oñate's arrival. In October 1598, 11 soldiers in the Spanish military and two of their servants were killed at Acoma Pueblo after a skirmish erupted. The Spanish military, under orders of then conquistador Governor Oñate, demanded that the Caras at Acoma turn over all of their food supplies essential to their survival over the winter. But it wasn't only the demand for supplies that led to the killings. Instead of first negotiating with leaders, the Spanish snuck into the Pueblo like cowards and raped an Acoma woman before raiding all of the community's carefully prepared food stores. And the death of one of the soldiers hit close to home. Oñate's nephew was killed. Retaliation was swift and without remorse. In January 1599, and under Oñate's orders, Spanish military ruthlessly killed 800 villagers, and they didn't spare women or children. They enslaved the remaining 500 villagers who were brought to Oquehuingue to face trial. In a true form of early New World justice, Oñate presided over the trial. The surviving villagers were handed stiff sentences for charges of rebellion and the murder of Juan de Salvador, 10 Spaniards and 2 servants. Girls under 12 were placed in the charge of a friar, boys in the charge of another. 60 girls were also sent to convents throughout Mexico. Women over 12 faced 20 years of servitude, another name for slavery. Men between 12 and 25 faced the same. Then, on his orders, the right foot of every man over the age of 25 was amputated. Between 24 to 80 men were mutilated as part of this decree. And it wasn't just men from Acoma who suffered. 2 Hopi who were visiting Acoma at the time also had their feet cut off, and they were sent back to their communities with evidence of their punishment for supposed rebellion. The innocence of other Pueblo communities was also not spared. The sentence, the cutting of feet, continued over the coming days in all nearby native villages. Many years later, after seeming unending violence and forced labor, the slow religious conversion of Pueblo communities, and with many of the original settler families abandoning New Mexico, in 1606, Oñate was fined and permanently banned from the region. He was forced to return to Mexico City, where he faced charges of cruelty to both natives and colonists. His conviction was later overturned by appeal, and he eventually made his way to Spain, where he was appointed head of the country's mining operations by the king. So defacing a human body, or even a public statue, as Michael Taussig has just so beautifully described, releases a surplus of energy, often negative energy. So anticipating the 400-year anniversary of Oñate's arrival in New Spain, the Oñate Monument and Visitors Center opened near Oquehue. The equestrian monument was made by Albuquerque artist Sonny Rivera. The Monument and Visitors Center was introduced by a bill through the state Senate, and funding was later secured through grants and tax bonds. And anyone who's really interested in this, there's a really great writer and scholar, teaches at the University of New Mexico, named Michael Trujillo, who's written quite extensively on this. But it wasn't until the 400-year anniversary that the monument met the same fate as so many Pueblo men before, when early in January, the same day and time as the original act, the statue's foot was removed, and the images of the foot and letters circulated to local media. So this act then trumped many of the planned centennial celebrations, and it also made international news. The monument's defacement once again brought into public consciousness the dark, bloody history of Spanish arrival in New Mexico, and the monument could no longer serve as a hero to the ignorant. But as we just heard, these kinds of acts proliferate others. And history as we know it is short, and public memory sometimes shorter. So inspired by this first monument, after the 400-year anniversary, an even larger equestrian monument was built in El Paso, Texas, to commemorate Oñate. At the time, it was the largest monument in the United States, the largest equestrian monument in the United States. Its unveiling was met with protests, and many Acoma people traveled to El Paso to voice their displeasure and to make their story known. The founders of this monument, perhaps realizing their wrong-headed intentions, but too late, of course, became increasingly evasive as to its intent and what it was to symbolize and commemorate. It is not formally specified now as a monument of Oñate, but as an equestrian monument instead. To the horse. I'm almost finished. And later, in 2004, yet another monument was erected to Oñate, and this one's 10 minutes from my house. And the first Spanish settlers, and this is in front of the Albuquerque Museum. And this is how it looked a couple of days ago. So this monument, which was first planned in 1997 as a collaboration between artist Betty Sabo and Sonny Rivera, you remember him from the very first monument, he was a sculptor, and Santa Clara Pueblo artist Nora Naranjo Morse. Morse stated in a newspaper article in 2005 that when she received the call in 1997, it changed her life. After uncovering more about the Spanish arrival, she realized that she could not participate in the project as planned, and instead created another work. Not a counter-monument necessarily, but something else. So the other day when my husband, Raven Chacon, and I were visiting this monument to take this photograph, we noticed something else beside the imposing bronze statues, and it was the beginning of a path. An entrance there was indicated with a metal plaque, and the sign read, Nora Naranjo Morse, Numbe Wege, which means our center place. This is the path. It's an environmental landscape, and it was commissioned by the Albuquerque Museum to provide a native response to the 500-year observance of Don Juan Dionate's, it should be 400, arrival in New Mexico. And there's a statement, there's a poem that she wrote about this piece called Our Center Place. What I really liked about it was when you take the spiral to the center, there's a rock, quite poignantly absent of any grandiose ideas of monumentality. And it reestablishes Pueblo understandings of the land. It's a quiet place, it's not a false idol. Importantly, you can't immediately see it in its entirety. You can't digest it only with your eyes. You have to walk it. You have to experience it with your body. You have to begin something of a journey. And it shifts the perspective of what is worth honoring, not a violent, murderous man, but the land. And I'm just going to conclude with these two pieces for Jimmy, and these are hopefully some released equestrian statues with the conquistadors gone. Thank you.
Hello again. I'm Richard Thomas. And I think it might be a good idea to not quite be myself for this talk, so I'm just gonna keep working with that identity. Yesterday I was the nice guy who talked about his mother. Today I want to ask some harder questions, not harder necessarily to grasp, but harder to say in public. Some of you may know that one of the things I've really struggled to do in my writing is to adopt a critical stance to not only toward how we've been represented by others, but also some of the ways in which we've chosen to represent ourselves. I find that much harder to do, and I guess there's a few reasons for this. The first is that I think we all share a strong sense of solidarity in our desire to think and fight our way out of our colonial situation, and I don't want to lose track of that. So I try to be critical, not to try to score points or look clever, but because I think a particular approach is actually not serving us very well. But the other thing that makes it difficult is that we have, in some cases, set certain topics more or less off limits to public criticism or maybe even public discussion. I think we have actually quite a few public secrets, things that we know not to know when we speak in public as Indigenous people. With this in mind, I hope to perform, naively probably, hope to perform a defacement and perhaps even a desecration. Thank you, Mick, for these tools. I think I'm going to be a bit clumsy in handling them, but I guess I'll just count myself successful if this defacement is productive in its destruction. What I want to claim is that we are in the process of making a monument of what we sometimes call the traditional, including especially certain models of spirituality and ceremony. I describe it as a monument because in many cases it has not only become fixed in place, but because its heroic recovery and preservation are less a recovery than an invention and less a preservation than an alibi concealing real and often terrible ongoing losses. So if this is a defacement, it's also, in a sense, a decelebration. Here I want to be very clear that I'm not talking about the deep knowledge that does exist in certain parts of our communities, and of course, among many of the people who are here. I'm talking about the signs of Indianness, often in the form of Indian spirituality, that are now circulating and are performed so widely and publicly in all of our communities, perhaps especially when we try to establish ourselves in institutions or establish our own institutions. They're especially ubiquitously performed and disseminated in social service agencies, I've noticed, and we're getting stricter and stricter about enforcing them as well. Those of you who have perhaps a deep understanding of your Indigenous language or have worked with historical objects and narratives or have spoken to older people who have a critical understanding of our histories know that most of what that's been passing for signs of Indianness for some time now is really largely, I'm just going to say it, New Age bullshit that was created since the 1970s. It was kind of just our bad luck that our cultural revival was coincident with neo-Rousseauian hippie romanticism, and we got a lot of that. It's probably more than bad luck, actually. It works really specifically and deadly against us. But now, so many of the stories and images that we share, and again by we, I don't necessarily mean us, but we, this problematic we that is us and is not us, I mean not necessarily us in this room, but we often do attempt to confirm the authenticity of our identity in forms that are at best pre-critical pan-Indian, kind of pre-critical pan-Indian melange or simply invention. it seems almost a rule that the wider a sign of Indianness circulates, the more likely it is to be exactly this sort of monument. And now I have to be brave and give what I think are specific examples. I'm thinking of dream catchers, I'm thinking of 4 sacred color designs and some of the teachings around that. I'm thinking about phrases like Turtle Island, Mother Earth, Great Spirit, things like that. And I'm thinking about forms that I've encountered, and I'll just give a few examples. Recently, my wife and I were staying with friends on the Fort William Reserve, just outside of Thunder Bay. And next door to the place we were staying, there was a large and recently constructed sweat lodge, one of those really big industrial-sized ones. And, you know, it had been, I think, created by the community to be used, again, partly in a kind of social service capacity. But the guy, it was interesting because the guy I was staying with told me that his father had come by one day and started wondering aloud why they were building it, since he felt pretty certain that they didn't actually use sweat lodges that way traditionally. And I don't know whether that's the case or not. I've heard different stories about that. But I've seen enough specific examples to think that that could certainly be true. And I think it's a kind of funny business when you have to perform ceremonies that are maybe not actually part of your cultural heritage in order to feel more like yourself. Here's another example. At York University in recent years, Indigenous faculty were involved in establishing a teepee on campus. This was odd enough, of course, given that traditionally nobody for thousands of miles lived in teepees. But this is a kind of pretty common thing in Toronto now, in Ontario. When my wife worked at Native Child and Family Services, they would send the kids off to camp, these city kids off to camp. And of course, it had to be in teepees for the sake of the kids' self-esteem as Indians. You know, if they were just camping in tents, I guess it wouldn't have been good enough. But anyway, I think that the really odd thing about this teepee at York is that it's become, now that it's become a kind of Indigenous monument on campus, it must, of course, remain fixed in place. This is what monuments do, but it's not what teepees do. Teepees like to move around. It's part of their teepee-ness to do that. So having this teepee stay in place is actually causing problems. It's not wheelchair accessible. So the path to it becomes impassable in winter or when it's muddy. And so soon the teepee is going to need a ramp leading to it and into it. And it's also probably going to have a wooden floor. So you can see where this is going. In order to be a monument of itself, the teepee has to stop being a teepee. And I think these disjunctions are all around us. And so I'm just going to give you one more example, again, from not long ago at York. I was once at a lunch meeting of Indigenous faculty there, and there was an elder in attendance who said a kind of indigenized version of grace, in which she gave thanks to for our food, including thanking the hunters for providing it. And this is a lunch, I should add, that was catered by University Food Services. It's not so much... I'm glad you're laughing. It's not so much the fraudulence of these various performances that actually worries me. I'm not against us making up new things if we're willing to say that that's what we're doing. But the monumentalization of our traditional culture and ceremony involves, I think, a kind of public secret. It's now common in our communities and in social service agencies to refer to the culture and mean traditional spirituality and ceremony. And this strikes me as a very disturbing turn in the language, much more dangerous to us than whether we're called Indians or Indigenous, for example. It means that we can bracket off our idea of culture to include spirituality and ceremony only. If we either sincerely, or worse perhaps, more likely mechanically, preserve these, we can avoid asking what wider and also more quotidian aspects of culture we have actually been losing. We can even celebrate our success, especially if, like me, we have nice middle-class academic jobs. I'm not much of a Marxist, but I think as daily life constantly now reveals, that he was right that you get the culture your economy will allow. I don't mean to be strictly economistic or that or what people used to call a vulgar Marxist. Obviously, I'm trying to make a cultural intervention here, so I recognize the force of culture, but all the same, it's really hard to explain how quickly and totally global capitalism has moved in the past few decades to dominate and reshape all areas of culture. I've seen it wherever I've worked, and no more so than now in the way that art schools are changing. It's not a prohibition of what one might say, but a restructuring of the terms of speaking altogether, and it's affecting all of us. This is why I love Rebecca Belmore's recent work, actually, in which she's positioned herself very deliberately as an artist worker. That gesture, to me, really sings out in a kind of refusal of the current moment and says something really important, I think, about where our allegiances should be. I don't think there's been an outside to all of this structure for some time, but I think now we can also see that the spaces within have been organized according to other that are within, but had been organized according to other principles, are also shrinking more quickly than most of us ever imagined was possible. And my fear is that by collapsing culture into a monumental spirituality and ceremonialism bracketed off from life, we'll lose track of the many subtle and deeply structured aspects of our cultural differences that might still be useful to us and possibly also to the world. I'm talking, I think, about the danger of a kind of indigenous liberalism in which we celebrate the individual success of various members of an emerging indigenous middle class, people like me and many of you, I guess, while gazing upon our monumentalized spirituality to calm our anxiety of all that we're losing in this process. But in keeping with the idea of defacement, my task here is not to shed light on this public secret to expose and eradicate it. I hope that's not what I'm doing. But rather to mobilize that potent secrecy into something powerful, as Mick has suggested. And I think we can do that just by recognizing our own agency in the construction that we've created. So much incredible energy has gone into simultaneously producing and concealing this monument, all the time. And it's premised paradoxically on the idea that our pre-contact ancestors had some perfection that we lack. An agency, a power of creation of ideas and ways of being that we do not. It's our fate, it seems, to merely preserve, in the worst cases, through blind imitation or mechanical ritual. It's common to defend a particular activity by simply saying that it's our culture to do so, as if nothing further need to be said, as if managing that tautology is our only intellectual task. We do it because it's what we do. That, in my opinion, is not much to aspire to. But think of how much energy goes into mobilizing and disseminating this illusion of stasis, how much creative agency. Let's celebrate that and let it give us the confidence to treat our intellectual heritage as a set of active tools. Let's not be afraid to manipulate and apply them. Let's do what many of you here have done by looking more deeply into some of these questions than many people are willing to. And let's not be afraid to say we are doing it. Let's not be afraid also to say what we don't know. I think this is the only way that we'll be able to summon up what we've lost, or better yet, how we'll be able to navigate our movement between past and present critically, productively, and not lose ourselves in monumentality. That's all. Thank you.
Well, hello. Okay, so Well, I will start by thanking Yvonne for this incredible opportunity to me. Anyways, it's very special for me to be here. It's a very beautiful way of entering this country that is now mine again, and feeling the power that is emanating from this meeting, and the dignity and the intelligence. It's very inspiring. So thank you very much, everybody. I want to thank Rebecca Belmore for her work and her power, and Sandra Semchuk for her, for her guidance. Right. So I'm gonna read because I just finished writing this at 2. So I have been thinking. Oh, okay, yeah. So I've been thinking on the ways in which my own life and history overlaps with what's being discussed here. I also went to a residential school, but my experience was absolutely the opposite of what is being done here. And that's probably one of the reasons why it's so hard for me to, it's been so hard for me until now, probably, to feel that pain that experience represents for many. So I went to that school with, as a way of escaping, actually. I was trying to escape poverty at home, and I was there voluntarily. And that was a very good opportunity to feel equal, and it was an opportunity to feel somehow happy too, and I was happy there in some ways. I want to read, anyways. So I could also pretend that I was happy in many and in many times I was. Certainly more than many others from my generation who ended up in abusive homes across USA, sent by their desperate parents to spare them from being brainwashed, or those who jumped with their parents into the sea to an almost certain death. But I was lucky. The revolution has been made for those like me, and I got a first-class education and a free engineering degree in Russia, where I spent 5 years at no expenses, other than my individual freedom. But I never had that, anyways. So, however, this lack that slowly grew uncomfortable, this lack of freedom, although it was never unbearable, grew up with the years. So by the time I made these photographs, I had quit my job as engineer and had decided to become an artist. Art seemed to provide a place from which I could at last talk about such lack of freedom, to share my questions and about the nature of power and its mechanism. So this series is an account of what could be seen from this point in which we are right now, a dystopian future. A post-monument era when the big figures and the events they championed had been erased. With our past, we were at the mercy of ruthless utopias. My experience at the time focused on a simple logic. If photography has been used to fabricate the official version of history based on its pretense of documents, I could simply expose photography's fragility to question that history. But with time, I had come to realize that I was trapped, playing the same game I was trying to subvert. My using of photography was ultimately confirmation of its documentary values. I was too isolating moments of history, focusing on the absence of large figures. I was also subsuming to other systems of power, that of the artwork, with its language of icons and limited editions. The problem lies within photography itself. Its selective nature makes it the perfect conveyor of the arrogance of power. It was meant to describe a reality in which there was one truth and it could be captured. one that no longer exists. So in order to imagine our new realities, we need to create new languages. It was already been said here yesterday, I think. I believe that the images technologies afford us today offer a very interesting alternative. I use the term new and images because I believe that the ways that we conceive of, create, and more importantly, share our images today encompass important possibilities that are obscured by applying the term photography to them. I think that all these silly experiments in creating images can be seen as a collective attempt. No, but just go online, please.
Sorry?
On the browser.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So I think that all these silly experiments that in creating images that can be seen as a collective attempt to communicate our experience of the world when politics, science, philosophy, and everything else seems to have failed. Anyone? Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Any? Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Yesterday we had a powerful and beautiful reminder of the ability of images to move us and to bring forth demons so we can confront them. And I very much empathize with Jeff Thomas when he claims that we need to learn to read images. But we all know that education shall come through practice. It should be a learning through creating. There is a lot of criticism about what these images show, but to classify areas of reality as banal implies it to be of second relevance in relation to another, more important, often sanctioned by ideologies or political ambitions. The new reality is to be described with a new language, one that eludes control, ever mutating, given to confusion, never quite understood. No categories of pedigrees. Transcendentally banal, so that we can let go of the image and see their own imagined. The new image seems to offer these possibilities. It is not about photographing the banal, but to embrace another apprehension of the image. Not for what it represents or says, but through its fragile relation to reality, its relation to everything else, now made so evident through their very existence. This is an important challenge for us, for those of us who are supposed to show others how to live and create images. I am at odds at this situation, and the way out I have found is to turn my classes into a reflection on this question. As we are all in the same place anyways. There are many possibilities to explore. Maybe the cameras will become at last the instrument to learn how to see. Or maybe we'll actually imagine a new language. But the first step is to learn not to be silent. Thank you. These are images from my class, one of my classes at UBC, I teach at UBC, and these are just very open experiments. So you see some hesitation into embrace these new images, and at the same time, the intrigue of what could happen, and I like the situation very much because it's a very tentative situation in which nobody really has a truth to show. Nobody feels inferior in failing, and I think it's a very productive situation, and that's why I brought this experiment here.
I'll start by saying thank you, Richard Thomas.
always wanted a big brother.
No, you have one now. Yesterday I started speaking about two journeys. Today is the second one. And it's going to focus on the photograph that you've seen displayed out in the lobby of the Indian scout that used to sit at the Samuel de Champlain Monument in Ottawa. And I can start by bringing up the images for. I had to condense my presentation, so I think basically what I'll do is just go through the images and tell the story from each image, and move from there. Go ahead. Okay. In 1992, a friend told me about a monument in Ottawa that I had to see, and it was for Champlain, but she was more intrigued to tell me about the Indian that was kneeling at the base of the monument. So we went up to Ottawa during the Remembrance Day week in 1992 and ascended the hill behind the National Gallery of Canada. Reaching the top of the hill, well, as you're actually walking up to the top, you see this very heroic Champlain kind of hovering in the sky. You get to the top and you get to the small platform at the top, and then you come face to face with this Indian figure. It was interesting for me at that time to look at the tourists that were kind of mingling around the statue, sitting on his lap, putting their arm around him, posing for photographs. And I couldn't help but feel sad to look at that situation and to think how symbolic it was for a lot of the things that we face, for a lot of the invisible things that we face. And so I sat there and I watched and I waited for all the tourists to leave. And then I walked over and I stood next to him. And I was really surprised at how lifelike his face looked. And I realized that I just couldn't simply photograph him like everybody else had done. So I started to talk to him. And I asked him who he was, where did he come from, how long had he been there. I told him who I was and why I was there. And then I asked him, the last question I asked him, I said, where would you go if you could leave this place? And then I made the photograph. Next. This is the photograph. When I had the opportunity to see the photograph, I was shocked because it reminded me so much of that first engagement with him and asking that question, and I felt responsible to it. I couldn't help but think about the things that I had seen and experienced when I was growing up, the things that I had to do to make myself walk again when I got out of the hospital, that I had to go through, about how you had to touch on something in order to get you through a difficult ordeal. And I thought, well, how different is this from that experience? So I looked at the photograph and I thought, I felt guilty because I felt like I had awakened something in this person that he wasn't prepared to address. And I felt that it was my responsibility from that point on to go out and find others that were like him as well, and to begin bringing those photographs back to him and to show him that he wasn't all alone. When you looked at the first image, one of the things that I looked at in terms of that monument was it revolving. And I thought, we have two stories here. We have the one on the top of Champlain that's circling around, and we see the landscape, and we see what emerged from his opening the gateway to Turtle Island, to North America, to Canada. And then when you look at the opposite direction of the Indian at the base, kneeling, and you look at the landscape, and it's a very different story that you begin to feel. This is what I wanted to touch on, and to begin looking at what the landscape told me in terms of our history and how we begin to make that sense of invisibility visible. How do we begin to move to a positive space? And the first was to begin looking for these other evidence of these types of Indians. This one here is not far from the Champlain Monument. It's actually the Department of Justice building, and it's the west side doorway that actually faces the Supreme Court of Canada. And I thought somebody had a lot of imagination when they put that up, to think about the justice and the Indian and the nearly naked Indian facing the Department of Justice, and there was its own story being told. Next. This image is in the center block of Parliament Hill. And what was interesting about this image and why I wanted to show it, because of the shooting that they had, there was an article in the Globe and Mail, and on the front page they actually had this photograph of this carved Indian face in the Globe and Mail, and behind it was a bullet hole in one of the windows in the center block. And the question was, should we leave the bullet hole to remember what had taken place? And I thought, we're missing the point all over again. Next one. This faces Parliament Hill, directly across from the center block. This is the Bank of Montreal. And on both sides of the bank, on the Spark Street side of the bank as well, there's another doorway that has the two Indians above the doorway as well. Next. One of the questions was how to intervene in this monument story, how to disrupt its narrative. Was it possible to do that? And so one year I brought my son up to the monument, introduced him to the scout, and posed him. And I didn't plan this photograph, but as my series of portraits with my bear, he always seems to wear an important T-shirt at some point. And it makes it into the bear portraits. This one was just as poignant. But once again, it was going back to the monument again and looking for inspiration and thinking about how do we begin to shift this? How do we begin to shift this? Next one. What happened is that in 1996, I had an exhibition at the Ottawa Art Gallery called Portraits from the Dancing Grounds, and it included the first photograph you saw of the Indian Scout. It was in the hallway outside of the main gallery doors, and it was interesting that it was there for the duration of the summer. And just as soon as the exhibition closed, there was on the front page of the Globe and the Ottawa Citizen was that the AFN had gone up to Nepean Point, the Champlain Monument, threw a blanket over the Indian, and wanted him removed. And I thought, I was really interested in the timing, and also too the fact that at that time the AFN office was just around the block from the Ottawa Art Gallery. So I was beginning to think, what was going on here? What was taking place? Something was beginning to shift. And so there was a great debate in the public media, in the Ottawa Citizen and on the CBC, as to whether or not the Indians should stay or be removed as the AFN wanted. And they cited two specific reasons. The first was the fact that it misrepresented the contributions that Indigenous people made to Canada and that he was inappropriately dressed. In 1999, the Indian was finally removed from the Champlain Monument and placed across the street in Majors Hill Park. I was against the removal because one of the things that I found that was really interesting was that it was a focal point in terms of continuing that conversation or trying to bring out that conversation of colonialism and talking about that history and how Indigenous people had been pushed to the sideline of what was taking place. So once he was removed, I thought, well, this was an interesting opportunity. How do you take what do you do when a monument has been defaced? So I wanted to continue the dialogue. I thought, everybody's going to forget that he's gone. Even though he's right across the street, he's packed into the corner of Majors Hill Park behind these bushes. Nobody's ever going to see him there. And he's just going to, what's he going to do? He looks like he's actually kneeling before Parliament Hill now. So I thought the AFN, in whatever it was trying to accomplish, had actually done the opposite. Because now he was isolated. Now the monument didn't have that cross to bear in terms of that history and addressing that history. It's very frustrating. So what I did is I started thinking about a new series of work called Seized Space. Next one. One of the stories that came out during the debate is that the Indian was supposed to have been placed in a canoe. The monument was unveiled in 1913, and there was no Indian on the pedestal there. In 1923, they put an Indian there, and he was supposed to have been in a canoe, have a paddle in his hand, but the funds, they weren't able to raise the funds to complete the monument, or the figure, so he just was kneeling at the base of the monument. And it was interesting to consider how different our perception of that monument would have been if it had been completed. And so I knew Greg, and I knew about the canoe that he had made, and I invited him to come up to Champlain Monument to be the first participant in Seize the Space in 2000. He brought it up, and we put it on the platform, and it was a gesture to say that we were coming along to try to complete this cycle. Next one. What we did afterwards is that then Greg portaged his canoe across the street to Majors Hill Park. and placed it at the feet of the Indian scout. Next. Last year, Greg invited me to take part in the Sakahan exhibition, and what I decided to do was to renew my Seize the Space exhibition, or portrait project. I should mention, next image please. Before I go there, what I'll do is, one of the things that really confused me about the placement in Majors Hill Park was the fact that now his nakedness was more amplified. And when you looked at him sitting there in that kind of bronze exterior of his, and the way that it looked, especially after it had rained, you just want to run your hand along it, right? And I wondered how many people did that. And if there were any photographs of somebody massaging the Indian scout. But I just happened to be walking through Chapter's bookstore, which is about half a kilometer away from the monument, and I ended up in the romance section. And to my amazement, I saw a row of books that had the kind of Indian Fabio on it, hence My Brave Indian. But it was kind of a snub at the AFN for their lack of foresight in what they did. Next one, please. What I did last year was to once again go back to the Indian Scout with the idea of Lest We Forget. It was kind of in concert with Sakahan, with the fact that it was the 400th anniversary of Champlain's arrival in that area. It was also the 400th anniversary of what we call the Two-Road Treaty, which was one of the first treaties in North America between my ancestors and the Dutch colony in present-day New York State. So all of these things kind of came together at this particular moment, and I wanted to have a celebration, and I wanted to bring people over to the Indian Scout and to kind of support him in a way. Next. This is in 2001. This is relates to Jen Bundy in the sense that I was in Switzerland. I had been traveling from Lausanne to Zurich. I was sitting in the train enjoying drinking Heineken and smoking cigarettes and having a great time. And I came back and I found out that I was taking part in a performance artist festival in Ottawa at that time. And what happened was that a call went out for people to come up to the monument and to pose. And next thing I know, I was up there making portraits of people that were coming up. And one of the things that we did is I offered for people to bring any kind of thing that they wanted to pose with that had significance to them, and to begin a conversation about what does that space mean then? What is that little square space at the base of that monument? What do we do with that? What is it symbolic of, and what do we turn it into? And so I wanted to bring people there and kind of just come together as a meeting place. Next. Some of you will recognize some people that have posed for me. This took place in 2011 when Adrian was in Ottawa for a performance, and I couldn't resist touching base with him and inviting him to come up to the monument. Next, please. This is one of the first participants in the portrait series in 2013, and it just gives you a sense of kind of the environmental dynamics around that monument. Next. It was interesting as well to come full circle with Greg, to come out during the opening events for Sakahan, come up to the monument and pose, and in a very interesting way, completing the circle that had begun in 2000. Next. This is Leanne Martin and her partner, Paul. What was interesting about this photograph, this was done on National Aboriginal Day last year, and what was interesting was it was going back kind of to the tension because nobody really, there was no identification about who the Indian Scout was, but in fact he was an ally of Champlain in that particular area that was going on during the fur trade in the Algonquin and the Huron, and in that same year they had attacked my ancestors in New York State, so there was this kind of this tension, historical tension going on around it, and these two were a perfect example of a modern day kind of coming together in terms of that history. Next, please. This is a class from Carleton University that came up. Every person in this group contributed some writing about their experience that was up there, and it was very interesting to get kind of this multinational kind of response to being a part of that. Next, please. This is the last photograph that was made. This was the first time that somebody had wanted to pose with the shirt off, and I wasn't, and so, but what I was looking at was I said, yes, of course. You can do whatever you want on this platform. And so Noel's from Manitoba, and he said that he wanted people to see that his culture was still alive. And as you can see on his chest. What was interesting is that I also made one with him with a shirt on just in case as a backup. But the important thing is that after, this was the last photograph that I made last year, and it was fitting because as we were packing up my camera bag to leave, one of my lenses fell out and it was smashed. And I thought, yes, I understand. And there's so much more that goes along with the story that I could go into. There's so many tangents that come with this monument that I've taken throughout my career and this journey that I've been on and that continues. And what I wanted to do at some point, I was hoping to show what my response, the end result was for this project, was the development of a new website that I have, and I'll give you the address. And it's jeff-thomas.ca. And I've been very fortunate to be working with a very brilliant person who does web design, and we've been able to put together my journey in terms of representation on this website. It's ongoing, it's going to be interactive, I'm going to be updating it with stories from individuals. I should point out that there were 240 people that posed for me on the monument during the Sakahan run, and all of them most of them are on the website now, but there's still a lot of work to do. And one more address is, there's another one, and just put Atlas dot in front of Jeff. And that's a new application that we developed as well that has a map that actually points out the journey. That's a work in progress as well. But I wanted to do that in terms of looking at the monument in terms of defacement, what it opened up, who were the culprits in that defacement, what do you do with the opportunity when something presents itself with you, and also too, how do you preserve what you've done? And this is what my website is about. I don't want to die and not have people know what I've done, because I feel that this is important. Donnie.
As penance, I am too. So you can call me Ron Thomas from now on. Do we have time for questions?
Sure. Sorry, you should just note, we absolutely do want this discussion to continue. I was hoping that we could maybe find consensus on not going for a 15-minute coffee break and just powering right into the next panel, if you don't mind. So yeah, please.
Just checking. Yeah, there we go. So who's first? Oh, this is the fun part. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Heather Schillinglaw. I'm a Métis artist, and I have a art piece that's actually up. I've mentioned this to others in the symposium here, and it's called Sweetgrass Sway, and it's my first public art piece, and I achieved a little bit of naivete in the fact that the piece itself, it's called Sweetgrass Sway, and it's large 14-foot flags assembled in a Métis figure 8 infinity symbol based on the ideas and the ideals of what Métis flag means. And it's 12 flags that are placed in this infinity pattern. And it was assembled in August of this year. And in September, 6 of the artworks had got kicked down, painted, knifed, and destroyed. So the problems that I had is from again, of course, the naivete of planning for idiot, is that as an artist, it was very offensive because, you know, the most offensive thing, other than the fact, well, it was all offensive, but that somebody came up to the artwork and actually painted on the flags. As an artist, I found it frustrating because it's like everybody says, well, you should contact the media. You should profile this as the defacement. And for me, I found, oh, great, if I make a ploy and get the media to look at it, the problems that I have is like, what else is going to happen? Is more of them going to get destroyed? Is it, you know, because I have to maintain this public art piece for 2 years. So I did create a little bit of a stir by contacting the Alberta Native News, and I don't know, I'm kind of looking for some advice here from the panel and or others as to what's the best approach, because even today I'm hoping that people that are going to Saskatoon can get a look at it. It's right off of College Drive on the other side. This is my little infomercial. Down from the University Bridge. It's on the right-hand side, adjacent to the Besborough Hotel. But even today, there's another flag that got kicked down and is missing. So I'm looking for advice.
It's one of the issues that you face when you put your work out in the public like that. And I think what you do is you begin rethinking it, and how are you going to turn it into something that is a conversation as opposed to a defacement. I don't know what the answer is. That's what you have to find. But I know that I've done a similar project like that last year, and I opened up an artwork of mine to be tagged by people that were coming to see the exhibition. Some of it was a bit unruly, and the curator was a bit upset that what was taking place, because this was a university art gallery. But the point is that it was to open up the work for public discussion, for people to take part in the process, whether it's good or bad. It's opening up the doorway to the community. And we have to keep that in mind when we talk about community-based works, is that it's not just there for display, it's there for engagement. And whether it's what we want or not, we have to go with what takes place and then work out the solution. And that's about the best that I can do in terms of offering support. But I think it's an important thing to do, but you have to figure out how you're going to make the most out of the situation.
Question up here at the... Oh, sorry. Yeah, didn't see it.
Richard. Oh, I'm David Cornell. So offensive. Thank you so much. I was just kidding. But I'd like you to clarify how your critique is not a classist critique, how it's different from Greenberg's critique of kitsch.
I gotta roll up my sleeves for that one. I think my critique is trying to raise the issue of class in a way rather than elide it, because I think we have been eliding it a lot. It gets subsumed in our Indigenous identity. So I've been thinking a lot about class. And I think the danger is that when I first got involved in art, I had just been through a class journey, I guess you could say. My mother went to university. You know, I grew up on a cattle ranch thinking I was probably going to be a mechanic, and then suddenly the whole world exploded into something totally different that I wasn't expecting. And I think a lot of people, you know, who are my peers and colleagues had a somewhat similar sort of experience. And I watched my mother go through that, you know, transformation because of the strength of her own will, and I really rode on the coattails in many ways. And I think that there's now that, you know, what I was trying to suggest in a way is now that we've arrived at a situation in which we have become successful within the terms of the institutions that are around us, professors, curators, famous artists, who are still in a not as privileged position as others in many cases. We really need to talk about what's happened, because it's only happened to a very small number of us, and I'm not even sure we've figured out what that means. Whether if the economic problems that we have partly come from the fact that our traditional cultures were very incompatible with capitalism, then our success must surely mean that we have assimilated ourselves into that system and must also then have lost something. So I feel very strongly, again, why I like Rebecca pointing to a worker as a kind of model for what an artist does, instead of the kind of 21st century knowledge worker, who's very estranged from that. And so I think we really need to have that conversation about what's happening with class. And again, we just hide it because we talk about poverty as being something that's part of being indigenous, but it's, we make jokes about garbage bags being Indian luggage, or these kinds of things that are all implicit with a kind of class problematic. I don't want to get up and say then that we are the ones who can have a more sophisticated relationship to our traditions or our spirituality because we're so educated. I think it makes it harder for us in a way. We have to really think through very many things. And so I don't think we're in a privileged relationship in that sense necessarily. I think there's a lot of, I often find actually when you go to communities and there are people who are really deeply steeped in knowledge, they cut through that bullshit a lot of the time, So it's not us who are there to do it. It's just that I feel it's something that I've witnessed and I wanted to say something about. Sorry, I'm going on and on.
But I guess what I'm getting to, though, is in terms of our responsibility or next steps. And I'm wondering if there should be a separation between what you were calling indigenous display and performance, actual being a spiritual person. And I'm also wondering that it seems like poor people will grab whatever cheap things they can have, whether they're cheap objects or cheap ideologies, in order to display that pride. And do we have a responsibility then to make things that are more approachable for those folks?
I think we have a responsibility to make the most intelligent thing that we can, and trust that that people will see that. In a way, you're almost talking about a kind of strategic essentialism or something like that, which I always found condescending. And so, I think Jimmy is a brilliant example of someone who can speak in a voice that is very much his own voice, talk about ideas that are important, that resonate, I think, across all sorts of worlds, and who could sit down and talk to anyone and have and learn something from them and give something back. We aspire to do this. Do I succeed? Do we all exceed? We struggle with it. That's all I can say, I guess. But that's a great question. Thank you.
Taussig, Kathy de Shimnikoshan. I was thinking while you were talking, Richard, because I teach at a university where we have First Nation specific counseling programs and social work programs, and being invited into a classroom, they had an art assignment, and of course some of those pan-Indian symbols that you were talking about certainly entered within the work that the students were doing that weren't familiar or had contemporary art be accessible to them. And I remember there's one young woman who was very proud of a dream catcher she made. And as part of her assignment was to talk about it. And she spoke about the impact of residential school. And of course I had discomfort with dream catchers and had discomfort, but what it seemed to be what became obvious was that dream catcher and getting to use that that sinew, that leather, was actually a portal to challenging that existence and acknowledging the existence of her parents and her grandparents who are residential school survivors. And I always felt within the realm of Pan-Indianism, it's tricky in the sort of spirituality you're talking about, because it seems to be so impacted by residential school. So how do we have criticality when there is that, what I consider a possible reality? The two are so intertwined, and I think we have to recognize that in our discourse within our art milieu, which is not the same as social work, which is not the same as these areas that are really holding on to some of those symbols. And one quick point, Peter Moore and I, we run a beading club, and we have lots of discussion at ours, and what I noticed was that there are students outside of whatever we're saying within that beading group that are online, because people taking on these arts that are considered more traditional are having these dialogues within. There is a younger generation discussing some of those issues and concerns, and I think one way is to pay attention to what they're doing. So if someone, you know, creates an earring with Coco Chanel on, there's this massive outbreak of dialogue and debate happening, and how it connects to spirituality. So it exists, and I think we have to pay attention to the younger generation and their value systems if we're going to challenge it. Marcy.
I don't want to hog the whole thing, so I think I agree with everything you said in a sense, and I don't want what I'm saying to be necessarily against that, and especially in an extremely traumatic situation. Of course, you work with the reality of what that is. At the same time, again, I still feel like there's a kind of power there that you want to kind of move through. So when you recognize that there's something that's a sign of Indianness for you, and it you know, and you're desperate that you need that sign, even if it's not an authentic sign, or whatever we want to call it. Still, I think that's maybe the first step on a journey to having a kind of richer understanding of what those processes are. Anyway, I'm totally inadequately answering your question, but I think those are real problematics that we have to work with. But first, I just feel like we've got to be able to say that, just be able to say it, because in a lot of cases, maybe you're a friendlier audience than I expected. But if we can't get if we can't get into the habit of just being honest about what we're seeing and thinking about things, publicly, we're in trouble in a way. So.
I see a lot of hands going up, and I don't want to interrupt the conversation by any stretch of the imagination, but we are constrained by time today, and I've just been told that we have time for only 2 more questions. Please, they're down here already. I'm sorry, everybody. If you can just keep your thoughts, and perhaps the conversation can continue throughout the rest of the day.
I'm Jen Budney, and my question goes to Manuel, but it relates to what almost everybody is saying, and we've sort of been talking about how nature abhors a vacuum. So when you remove something from a monument, when you take something away, something very quickly comes to fill it up. And Manuel, the photographs that you showed that you took back in Havana of the monuments that had been, they weren't defaced, they were utterly removed by the revolutionary government. And in that absence of anything filling that space, you talk about the profound unfreedom in Cuba, and I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on that. And I think it does relate to what everyone is mentioning, and even what Richard is talking about too, what has come to fill a space that had some absence there, right? Mm-hmm. And when you're not allowed to have what Jeff encourages in his work, real open dialogue that involves everybody to comment on what's filling up that space, or what could or what should. If you could just elaborate a little bit on that, what that absence of monuments in Cuba means.
Well, it means, of course, laxing history, right? And the possibility that then that history is completely manipulated to manufacture whatever you want to manufacture. But following the thought about Cuba, is that in Cuba, the thing in Cuba is that this these empty spaces became very evident because of the culture. Because you are erasing the monument, but the history is on the walls. So it was a very stark and silly, you know. It was more like symbolic. It was a real demonstration of power, basically. And then going back to what has been said right now, thinking about Cuba is that role of culture is truly important, and it's a question that we had to deal first at the turn of the 20th century, and intellectuals had the same challenge that you guys have. We have now. Sorry. In terms of the challenge is always how do you speak to your community and bring it to where you are, right? So I'm struggling with all my life with public art. How do you deal with that? And it's part of that. How do you make culture be part of the people without necessarily putting it in a pedestal? It talks to people, and that's how you bring people to those realizations. And we have to also accept all levels of culture. That's also a big challenge. How do you put all of that together? Use tax.
Our last question for the session. Thank you.
I also begin my question or begin my statement reacting, or I hope productively disagreeing with you, Richard. I think part of what I found quite effective about your provocation, which I also felt was very generative, was the story of thanking the hunters at the university. But why I didn't find that story particularly funny at all is because it seems like one additional moment of microaggression amongst a kind of structure of the university where that from the outside that is so total and so fully, or at least in my university experience. So I guess I wonder, of course we can laugh, but when it starts to happen from the inside, it begins to feel like the ongoing of the ongoing, and I think we reach a point of cultural fatigue. This cultural fatigue, these microaggressions, they inhabit the body. I think they begin to work at a very cellular level. This sort of cellular level, I think, is very on par with a kind of policing, with a kind of police violence, which can often end up finding an endpoint in, I think, the kind of interiors of the self. So I'm very hesitant to agree with anything within a community. I'm very hesitant to agree with what you're saying because I really fear that it might lead to a kind of self-policing. But that basically in order to do something with this, because again I did find what you're saying very generative and also something I can absolutely relate to. I'm often cringing in almost physical pain at these in my own culture's tokenistic displays or shows, because I can see how easily they can be co-opted. So what I'm offering as a way out of this, because rightly or wrongly solidarity is a thematic concern this weekend, is that in this transferal of in this space between sort of things that are genuinely meaningful and these more tokenistic moments or displays, we have a process where we could watch something becoming not desecrated, but deconsecrated. For me, the deconsecration of something has a very kind of ethical or political importance, because it implies the movement of something not from sacred to empty, but something from sacred to profane. profane doesn't mean it doesn't have its own kind of sacredness. It has a kind of everyday banal workability. So I suggest we find no hierarchy between sacredness and profane, between the sacred and the profane. But I suggest that we decide strategically when to employ these. And I want to offer one very practical example. Within the court system in New Zealand, which is the context I grew up in, these kinds of like very ritualistic activities have become completely total. But this suits very painfully the fact that a lot of people moving through the criminal justice system are indigenous peoples of various tribes or nations. One thing this has led to is that within those kind of tokenistic spaces, lawyers in a very radical way have been arguing for re-evaluations of kind of demonstrations of demonstrations of kind of apology, demonstrations of how you show your body as remorseful. So within what I'm ineloquently getting at is that you can co-opt that space that the state has kind of allowed for, and within that you can basically hijack it.
Okay, I could say a lot to that, but I know we're probably done, so we'll carry the conversation on. I don't think we disagree too much, actually, but anyway, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you.
No, I enjoyed it. I really did. No.